Joining me now, Chris Merritt, contributing legal editor to The Australian and Vice President of the Rule of Law Association. Chris, 6 weeks only for something that is just gargantuan in terms of the potential impact to our Constitution. Of course, we only have the words that the Prime Minister's put on the table. We don't have everything else they're working on quietly and secretly internally that will sit behind this voice if it gets up. What did you make of today?
Well, it confirmed to me that there's a need to refine the proposal. We've got very different views emerging about whether the form of words that would be inserted into the Constitution would or would not trigger an avalanche of litigation. Now, it doesn't matter what side of that argument you come down on. There's a dispute. There's differences of opinion. That tells me that the wording isn't clear, and if it remains unclear, those disputes will be resolved one way or the other in the High Court. So it would be smart right now for the committee and then the government to refine the proposal and eliminate as much as possible those disputes and probably eliminate the risk of litigation.
One of the things I find interesting is when you push the working group and Aboriginal leaders, it's clear they want a big voice. They don't want it to be what the Prime Minister's trying to tell us, just a moral goodwill thing that will just provide polite advice and close the door on their way out. I mean, this is an activist body. And we go back to Megan Davis, we saw her on the screen there before, as she gave what's called the Higginbotham Lecture in Melbourne last year. And she said First Nations people in Australia from day one are seeking substantive, not symbolic recognition. Now, if they want substantive recognition, if they want a vehicle to make great change, that's very different than what the Prime Minister's trying to sell the Australian people.
Quite right. Look, very few people would be against symbolic, true recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution.
I agree with that.
The reality is Indigenous people were the first occupants of this continent and they should be recognised as such. Now, that's completely different to the proposal that we're now asked to consider, which in my view would destroy the concept of equality of citizenship. It would empower a new institution to have a say, make representations on anything effectively to Parliament and to the Executive. And the wording is wide open. It's not representations on proposed laws or policies, it's representations on matters. Now that leaves it wide open to cover things like, should Australia Day be moved? That's not an issue.
Just on that, let me jump in. Because Linda Burney, this was put around today, and Linda Burney came out and said, well, no, that's not right. The Voice will have nothing to do with Australia Day. We heard the PM say just recently the Voice wouldn't have been consulted on something like, or wouldn't have given advice either, on something like the safeguard mechanism. He said it's not about foreign affairs, it's not about defence. But that's not right, is it?
Well, if it's not about foreign affairs and it's not about defence, why not put that in the constitutional provision so that we can be sure of it? It's no good after the referendum to try and pass an Act of Parliament to say, well, the Voice can't give representations on subjects A, B and C. The High Court will strike that down in 2 seconds. That will trigger litigation. If you want to focus the Voice on matters that really count, on things that would eliminate or at least address Indigenous disadvantage, focus it on Indigenous disadvantage. Don't focus it on matters that are way beyond what should be its proper remit. Australia Day could be vulnerable. There's no restriction in the form of words that would go into the Constitution.
And I want to underscore this point. The reason why there is no restriction, Chris Merritt, is because there is a strong body of evidence there and speeches given and papers written by Aboriginal elite activists that they want the Voice to be as big as possible because the Voice is the vehicle for co-governance. Co-government like we see in New Zealand. The Voice isn't an advisory body. If it was constrained, as you suggest, just to Aboriginal disadvantage, it truly would be an advisory body. But they don't want an advisory body. They want a significant new arm of government.
Look, interest groups can want whatever they like. The reality is this constitution is not owned by a subset of society. This constitution is owned by all of this country. Everybody in this country has a stake in this. This is not something that's within the gift of one subset of society. This is everybody has a stake in this. And it might feel nice about doing the right thing by people who have had a very, very difficult history. But the reality is liberal democracy based on equality of citizenship is fundamental to what it means to be Australian. And that shouldn't be given away lightly. And it will be given away unless the focus of this institution is narrowed. There's no logic in giving one group of people an extra say on everything that is denied to other citizens. That will have the exact reverse effect.
People say that's not right though, Chris. You know, the pro-voice lobby, there's a few of them here on Sky News occasionally, and they say that this isn't about creating two classes of citizenship. I think it does. You're arguing it does. Explain why that's a fact that they can't hide from.
All right, here's the reality. There are two issues, scope and reach. Now, the scope of the voice is the subject matter that it can cover, and the second clause gives it unlimited scope. It can, and that comes about through this mechanism. The only restriction is that a matter that it must relate to Indigenous people, and Indigenous people are citizens of this country. Therefore, any law, any public policy that relates to citizens of this country relates to Indigenous people. That's the unlimited scope. The unlimited reach is how far it can go into the executive, into administrative decision making. Decision makers that go out of their way to try and be fair and obey the law and listen to the instructions of ministers and departmental heads will suddenly have to take account of race-based representations by an organisation whose sole purpose is to influence public policy on the basis of race. Now, that's a radical shift.
All right, go leave it there. Sorry, Chris, I'm just getting out of time, but I think the point's well made. We will talk to you, I am sure, over the next 6 weeks as this all works its way through the committee. Thank you for your time, Chris Merritt.